Captivity affects hundreds of species that represent numerous different genera, families, orders, classes, and phyla of animals. These different species are found in various types of captivity, where some are for research on conservation. However, most of the captive sites are for entertainment purposes, including the 10,000 zoos worldwide. One of the largest classes impacted is the class Mammalia, with over 4,800 of its species found in captivity. Although there is an abundance of animals in captivity, there is also a plethora of species that cannot be kept in captivity yet. Their environmental and behavioral requirements are too difficult to replicate and maintain in captivity, making it too expensive to support and take care of these specific animals, resulting in a risk of harm to be taken. To keep the animals safe, they are not found in captivity, but rather are kept in their native environments. Mammals in captivity have been influenced differently compared to if they lived in the wild. One of the main aspects influenced by captivation is the behaviors of the animals, and it is taken into great consideration when found in captivity. In fact, there are several attributes that play a role in the differentiation between the two groups. Between the amount of human interaction to the type of enrichment the mammals receive, it all takes part in shaping the different behaviors exhibited. There are several short and long-term effects present on mammals in captivity's behaviors, and both components are equally as important in the behavioral differences in the two groups. The short-term effects are better known overall because they are more commonly seen in captivity, while the long-term effects are more poorly understood. They are still prominent enough, however, to pose a difference between free-living and captive animals. Let's start with the short-term effects on behavior. One attribute to behavioral differences lies within the animal's availability of control and decision-making. In the wild, a free-living mammal is capable to be in more control of their environment and intake of outside stimuli throughout each day. These mammals do not rely on another source to provide them with their needed stimuli, and instead completely provide for themselves. On the other hand, mammals in captivity have a very limited amount of control over their territory. The facilities they are living in control a majority of their external stimuli the mammals encounter, so they rely heavily on an outside source. They are not able to be in control of their intake and stimuli, as it is forced upon them through their caretakers. This then causes the issue of the mammals not having to compete or behave in their natural state with their groupmates for elements such as territory or food. Another short-term effect that plays into the contrast of behaviors is stress. Wild animals do not necessarily exhibit peculiar actions when in stress as much as confined animals do. One of the more noticeable events of where stress is present is found during times of fear. Free-living mammals are capable of using their fight or flight responses depending on the situation they are facing. However, animals in confinement seem to lack the ability to respond correctly when faced with a fearful situation. They have a very limited amount of freedom to move about, which results in the inability of using their fight or flight responses correctly because they cannot escape. The stress in animals in captivity may even lead to boredom and dullness, which progresses to a more serious issue called zoochosis. Zoochosis is the stereotypical behavior of animals found in captivity that occurs generally in animals that exhibit boredom. This is just a brief summary of the topic, but we will address this in more detail later on in the video. But for now, let's talk a little about some long-term effects that take place on behavior in captivation. Numerous genetic mechanisms alter and influence captive mammals' behavior, which can cause the distinct difference between them and their wild counterparts. This is due to the inevitable inbreeding that occurs throughout captivity, as well as a tiny amount of genetic drift from the lack of diversity within captive populations. The outcome is a lower health condition in their natural habitats, making the mammals in captivity more prone to diseases that are found in the wild. If these mammals were to be released into the wild, they would have a shorter lifespan if exposed to the diseases that their wild counterparts became protected against. On the other hand, the free-living mammals have a lesser chance of inbreeding and have a better genetic diversity, which in all causes a better health. Three key processes non-randomly alter the gene frequencies within animals in captivity, and they are artificial selection, natural selection, and relaxation of selection. Artificial selection is very goal-oriented and relatively fast. It is a selection process of desired behavioral traits that are then produced into a specific species. This process is highly human interference-based and is very common in domesticated animals. It can even be an indirect result for other morphological attributes. Natural selection is most intense in the first few generations. It is an evolutionary change where the individuals best adapted to their environment produce more offspring to succeeding generations. In this case, natural selection takes place to adapt a species to the captive environments they are placed in. The final process is relaxation of selection, which results in an increase of genotypic and phenotypic variability. This usually affects behaviors involving predator avoidance, reproductive isolation, and shelter seeking. The process means that behavioral traits typically not found in the wild are found in captive populations. Another long-term effect is the influence of human contact, which is very common in captivation, especially with young mammals. It can even potentially lead to later consequences in adult animals. For instance, if a young mammal is removed from its mother during their time of filial imprinting, it is possible for it to imprint on their caregivers in captivity. This can cause differences to arise between the adult forms of both the captive and free living. The wild mammals do not have the opportunity to have much human contact, let alone imprint on a human, in their natural habitat, so their only mode of filial imprinting is on their mothers. Mammals' ability to play is psychologically stimulated and very difficult to replicate in captivity. In fact, mammals in captivity typically play more routinely because of the small habitat they live in. They have to keep themselves occupied or else early onsets of zoochosis and boredom begin to arise. On the other hand, mammals in the wild have activities to keep themselves occupied, like hunting and trying to survive. Without play in captivity, mammals begin to experience a low stimulus diversity, which can cause erratic and harmful behaviors. Boredom is a major outcome in the lives of mammals in captivity. It's the response most animals experience in lieu of their natural habitats due to the certain stimuli being absent. Many captive animals end up lowering their expectations to the level of stimulation that they are receiving. With that being said, commonalities such as zoochosis begin to arise. The symptoms become very prominent at times, and it can even lead mammals to harm themselves. Zoochosis is the stereotypical behavior shown by captive animals due to the boredom and confinement they experience. Their actions such as pacing, swaying, head bobbing, twisting, self-mutilation, and others are very repetitive and usually not completed to reach a goal. They are typically seen as a bad thing when comparing the two groups because they are not normal actions seen in the wild. The causes are typically of a wide variety, however, they all stem back to the lifestyle captivity provides mammals. It is quite confined, boring, and different than their native lifestyles in the wild. Even though captivity can lead to some serious issues in mammals, there are plenty of ways to increase the exhibition of naturalistic behaviors. A great start would be to give the mammals more land to roam. Instead of a few acres allotted to each exhibit for each species, there could be one exhibit for animals from the same area. For instance, a large African savanna could be built over an abundance of acres where different types of species can roam together. This could be a little risky between predators and prey, so this idea would have to be something to research in depth. But it could be a great starting ground for something that could potentially lead to happier and healthier animals. The second suggestion I have is to switch up the routines of the animals. There have been studies conducted showing that animals get bored with their daily routines, so I propose changing the routines every so many days or weeks. This way the animals are not constantly doing the same activities day in and day out, and do not get as bored as easily. Another proposition is to alter the concrete holding cells mammals are contained in when their exhibits are being cleaned. A study was conducted in 2010 at the Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago to study the behavioral difference of apes when in their enclosures versus their holding areas. At the end of the study, it was discovered that chimps especially became more aggressive and tend to groom and scratch themselves more in their holding areas. When put into holding areas, a sudden change occurred in the behaviors of apes. If the holding areas were either bigger or livelier, there could potentially be a chance that the animals would not go through such a drastic change in behaviors in the two environments. The fourth idea I have is to use enrichment to replicate the mammal's naturalistic behaviors. For instance, a study was conducted in brown bears that involved the frequency of feeding locations. Throughout the feeding times of 5 days, the food location was at different spots throughout the enclosure. This allowed the bears to bring forth their naturalistic behaviors of hunting for food. In the wild, mammals do not know where their next meal is located without hunting for it, so by scattering the food throughout the enclosure, it allowed the brown bears to bring forth their natural hunting abilities. My fifth and final suggestion is to keep mammals in their natural groups, consisting of natural size and ratio of male to female. For instance, polar bears are considered to be solitary animals, but not necessarily territorial. They can be somewhat social during the ice-free period, and can even be seen play fighting with each other during this time. But other than that, they typically do not interact with other polar bears. So they would need an enclosure to keep them somewhat separated when need be, but still be able to allow the mammals to access each other in times of social spurts. On the other hand, lions are considered very social animals. They live in prides and are always found with other lions. So they would need an enclosure that is capable of bringing them together, but still allow them to roam to bring their naturalistic behaviors out. Both groups would also need the correct ratio of male to female mammals to replicate their own wild environments for reproductive success in captivity. All in all, captivity does change a mammal's behavior compared to their wild counterparts. Human interaction and the amount of stress an animal experiences are two of the most common impacts that alter behavior, which can potentially lead to the issue of zoochosis. However, there are certain steps we can take to increase the behaviors of captive mammals and decrease the amount of change between mammals in captivity and their wild counterparts.